Right. Namaste. Welcome everyone for the second session of our Hindu Heritage Month Enlivening Hindu Heritage Virtual Conference series. And so we've recognized October as Hindu Heritage Month, a community-based celebration of cultural heritage of the Hindu society at large. And so with VHPA, Vishwa Hindu Parishad of America, Hindu University of America, we've come together to put together this collaborative project, series of webinars, conferences, talking about different important issues for the Hindu community. And today is Hindus for Social Good. And we have Dr. Parth Parihar, Uma Vishwanathan, Dipali Kulkarni, and Dr. Indu Vishwanathan as our panelists. And I am going to just briefly talk about, what we're doing in the Hindu community, how we're coming together, and raising our voices, especially the diaspora, right? American-born Hindus trying to share our perspective, our vision for not just the Hindu community, but for the world, and do good in that process, right? Follow that dharmic path. So just briefly, let me introduce our moderator for today. It's going to be Dr. Parth Parihar. And I was just looking through his background. It's amazing. Dr. Parth Parihar is at the vanguard. He is a leader in so many ways. He's currently a Max Weber postdoctoral fellow at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy. He was previously a postdoc at the Wallace Institute of Political Economy at the University of Rochester. He got his PhD in economics from Princeton University, and Parth's academic work lies at the intersection of microeconomic theory and political economy. The interconnections and some of the research that he's done are cutting edge, groundbreaking, mind-opening. And he studies the forces that promote and hold back cooperation within groups of diverse agents working together towards a common goal. And in the Hindu community, this is so prescient, right? So many different Hindu groups and organizations are diversity. And we know we haven't come together at the level and in the way that we need to. So his research is so prescient, important, and again, working towards that common goal together. Dr. Parihar currently serves on the board of trustees for the Hindu Students Council and has been involved with the HSC since 2014. He's also the co-director of the Understanding Hindu Phobia Initiative with Dr. Indu Vishwanathan. And there's so many other things that Dr. Parihar is doing to bring awareness in so many ways about not just Hindu phobia, but Hindu Dharma and how it can manifest in educational, institutional, and I think political spaces, economic spaces, all of these important spaces. So with that, let me hand it over to Parth, and he's going to introduce the rest of the panelists and walk us through this webinar. Parth, to you, Dr. Parihar.
Thank you so much, Ankurji, for that very, very generous introduction. Namaste, everyone. My name is Parth Parihar, and I'm privileged to be the moderator for this panel, Hindus for Social Good. One of the most important yet underrepresented impulses within the Hindu diaspora is the desire to contribute positively to the communities in which we live, like Ankurji was just saying. And in this context, I think we often think about seva, and for good reason. But this panel will go beyond seva and encourage us to think about the ways in which we can give back through our careers and as an integrated part of our Swadharma. We'll also ask what it means in the context of Hindu Dharma to actually do social good. What does it exactly mean? And as I said, I'm very lucky to be joined by the panelists here today to sort this all out. The three women with me on the panel today are trailblazers in their various fields and represent three unique pathways to contributing to society, each of which is inspired by their Hindu roots and traditions. So welcome to all of our panelists. So first we have Uma Viswanathan-ji. Uma-ji is Director of New Pluralists, a funder and field collaborative that is strengthening the growing field of funders, practitioners, storytellers, researchers, and innovators who are working together to satisfy our deep cultural hunger to heal our social divisions in ways that honor human dignity, repair harm, foster empathy, and widen our circle of human concern. So very needed in our polarized environment today. She brings 15 years of experience leading, advising, and investing in people and projects dedicated to creating positive social change. Prior to her current role, Umaji was a senior program officer at the Robert Wood Johnson Foundation, focused on advancing collective forms of leadership for health equity and well-being, and a program officer of racial equity and community engagement at the W.K. Kellogg Foundation. Prior to entering philanthropy, she was director of leadership development at Urban Habitat, developing cohorts of social justice leaders from across the Bay Area's region to join strategic local and regional boards and commissions. She also founded and directed Nouvelle Vie Haiti, a network of 300 plus young Haitian leaders who empower their communities to manage their own trauma, establish greater food security, and develop healthier relationships. Umaji is a certified meditation and breathwork instructor with the Art of Living Foundation and received a BA in psychology and an MA in the history of science from Harvard University. So thank you so much, Umaji, for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me.
Next, I'd like to introduce Deepaliji. Deepaliji Kulkarni is the former director of human rights at the Hindu American Foundation, or HAF, which I'm sure we're all familiar with. She holds an MA in Asian religions from the University of Hawaii at Manoa, a master's in women's studies from the University of Oxford, and an MPhil in religion from Syracuse University. So thank you so much, Deepaliji, for joining us for the panel here today. And last but not least, I'd like to introduce my colleague, Dr. Indu Viswanathan. Induji is currently the Director of Education at the Hindu University of America. She received her master's in elementary education and doctorate in curriculum studies from Teachers College at Columbia University. Induji received a BA in economics from Cornell, and she has been a student of His Holiness Sri Sri Ravi Shankar for over 15 years. Induji has spent over 2 decades in the field of education, serving schools and educational nonprofits. While director of research for Yes for Schools, she studied the effects of yogic practices on well-being in American public schools. As an educational ethnographer, Induji is committed to learning from and contributing to the lived experiences of immigrant families, particularly at the intersection of education, indigenous traditions, post-colonial diasporas, and decoloniality. Induji is the co-founder and co-director of Understanding Hinduphobia, an initiative to increase public consciousness and discourse about Hinduphobia, build allyship, and nurture scholarship. So thank you so much, Induji, for joining us on the panel today.
Thank you, Parth.
So everyone, I just want to start out with a very basic question. You each represent a very unique vision of what it means to be social good. So I wanted to begin by asking, how have you engaged with social good as a Hindu person? And how were you inspired to pursue the path that you eventually did? Umaji, maybe we can start with you.
All right. Yes, happy to start. And I'm going to give a disclaimer. If you couldn't tell, Induji and I are sisters. So I think actually a lot of the origins I want to actually attribute to our parents. A lot of the values that we grew up with really had to do with this idea that our lives are about more than just ourselves and the accumulation of wealth and status and success. The different expressions of it. So I want to even, call in both my tatas. Like one of my grandfathers was a doctor, and after he retired, he ended up opening a free clinic to be able to provide medical services to the broader community. This was a huge influence to kind of grow up and be a little kid and to be absorbing that even when somebody is at a later stage in their life, that their life is about something greater than just, of course, reflecting and reflecting on the life, but to also see that there is some greater purpose there. And our other grandfather was also a civil servant who really took care of the community. And in addition to a really large family that he had to take care of, there were just certain values that were such a core part of what it meant to be part of the family that got passed down. It got passed down kind of through the generations. And I think that so much of that actually is the way that the sense of purpose being about social good gets transmitted is through our parents and through our ancestors' values, and what they show us matters most. So for me, I think my entire life, I knew that my life had to be about more than more than just taking a traditional path. So I started off knowing that my life, I knew I wanted it to be about people in some way, that I was so curious about human beings and what makes us tick. And I actually started off, in college thinking, well, I should probably do psychology, I guess. And the deeper I went into Western psychology, the further I felt from people. It was something that created a lot of dissonance within myself. It felt like there was something about it that was about understanding and sort of distancing ourselves from the study of the mind and emotion, as if we can somehow be objective in some way, as if we're not in relationship with people in some way. And so actually that was my history of science degree, was to actually understand the history of Western psychology, medicine, psychology, because it felt so off to me. And that is actually how I found my way into art of living and into just a full on, our Hindu tradition, our Hindu orientation to how we make sense of the world, how we make sense of our relationships with the natural environment. So I would say my pathway, into doing social good was definitely rooted in the values that my family taught me, but the expression and the lens that I bring to it, it has to do with that deep nurturing that I was able to have. I was a full-time art of living teacher, traveling around the country, traveling around the globe, teaching pranayama, breath work, this dharmic knowledge to so many different kinds of communities, well beyond, those who were born Hindu, and really starting to see, wow, this is what it means to be Sanatana Dharma. This is what it means, that this is so universal. It is so helpful to so many people. And to actually have that be a direct experience that, when I would work with, kids who were transitioning out of gangs in the Bronx, or these kids who were really grappling with such major trauma in Haiti, to see that the breath, the mind, all of this wisdom that we have can be so valuable to so many different kinds of people. And so, from there, kind of moved from that, doing that full time, and really found my way into the traditional sort of nonprofit and philanthropic world that we find in the United States. But it is a forever part of my lens. It's like I can't take away my Hindu-ness from how I see the purpose in my life and sort of how social change itself happens.
That's super interesting, and I think one of your and Induji's parents is actually in attendance here today, and I'm sure they're very proud of all of the social good that both you and Induji have done through the years, and how that's been inspired by your upbringing. Maybe we can go to Induji next. Do you have anything to add about your background and how it influenced you to pursue the social good that you did, and why you chose the path that you eventually took?
Absolutely. I mean, in addition to everything that Uma described, I would say the other part of it was just the beauty and expression of Dharma at home. Was a lot. Our mother is a musician, a singer, so there was just always a lot of celebration. Even the festivals, I think oftentimes, and especially maybe the Hindus from South India can relate to this. They often get encumbered with like, well, we have to make this thing, we have to make this food, we have to do. But actually, there was so much musicality and lyricism and joy in that celebration. So, while I agree, like this idea of principles and having a sort of sense of purpose that's larger than ourselves was what was sort of encoded also in things that are really beautiful in their expression. And I think that's why they carry, because it wasn't this sort of like moral certitude. It was more around, how do we, and it certainly wasn't around moral platitudes either. It was really around this. I mean, I'm a musician, so for me, the musicality of it, Uma is an artist, so I'm sure it emerges through her art. The ways in which it was encoded in everyday living, and wasn't like about sitting down and giving us lectures about morality, but was really about how do we live this in a way that's really vibrant and appealing. I think is what has sustained it in my life. So I really, and when I think about when our parents immigrated here, and how few Hindus there were around, and the ways in which they were able to enliven that for us in the 70s and 80s. I mean, there was, compared to now, there were very few Hindus around to make it so appealing, and also offer it to us in a way where we could be fully integrated, right? They also appreciated the beautiful things about American life. It wasn't that they wanted to raise us in a bubble that was separate. So it's not like we had to be two separate people outside of the home and inside of the home. It was an offering that could be taken up in a way that was integrated. And I think that's played out beautifully in our lives. So I wanted to add that as well.
That's really amazing. And it's really, really great to hear how the richness and the vibrancy of Hindu traditions actually inspired you both to do the work that you do. Now, I want to bring in Deepalaji into the conversation. Deepalaji, you took a very specific path, serving as the Director of Human Rights for the Hindu American Foundation for so many years. What inspired you to pursue that path, and what aspects of that path engage with social good and engage with your Hindu identity as well?
Yeah, so good question. I think I was grateful to be able to work for the Hindu American Foundation for about 1.5 years. This came after I was spending many years studying Hindu women through degrees in religious studies and women's studies. And so I really saw the tension in the academic space in trying to explain Hinduism correctly and authentically. And then a lot of the challenges that Hindus have been facing have kind of been overlooked by the activists, organizations, and governments that are supposed to be championing, the rights and freedoms of all people. So, seeing this continuous tension of just being able to articulate the challenges that Hindus have faced have been my main drive in applying for to work at the Hindu American Foundation and the work I did there. And I think even before that, each and every activity that I engaged in was always targeting how to help Hindus and how to help Hindus be understood. So for me, social good was not just about helping Hindus be able to flourish, but also helping others understand about Hinduism so that Hindus may flourish. And I did that in a variety of ways, whether it was teaching or serving at my local mandir. My guru has this saying that's become very popular. He has a lot of sayings, but one of them is, "In the joy of others lies our own," and that's Pramukh Swami Maharaj. And that kind of, his teachings kind of molded me, all the good parts of me at least, into the person that would be interested in serving. Because even from a young age, whether it's, cooking and giving, at the local mandir so that the community has food or anybody that comes has food, or, having specific moments where you're able to help another person, social good was something that you did, and you weren't giving anything away from yourself. You were actually adding a lot of value to your life and a lot of understanding about others and yourself. And so social good is something that I have to be honest, it's different when you're working in it full-time as a career versus, just doing it in your personal life. It's very different. If you can imagine the stresses of a professional life, for example, as whatever we're doing, whether it's a business or in the medical profession or what have you, that environment is very different. And then when you put into it the challenges that Hindus are facing in having the atrocities that they're facing, for example, in Bangladesh and Pakistan, to have that be understood, and to have in a professional setting so much animosity from specific organizations or specific government entities, it is incredibly challenging. So that's why it's so important for not only, in our personal and professional lives outside of, dealing with, these Hindu atrocities, but also the atrocities that Hindus have faced, but also for organizations like, the Hindu University of America, like VHPA, like HAF, to continue their work, because Hindu Americans are at such an important crossroads, and this is really allowing for these voices and for this activism to take place.
Yeah, I really appreciate that perspective on your work in helping make sure that our community is understood, and also understood not just by others, but also ourselves. There's many instances that I've come across where Hindus aren't aware of the atrocities that happen within our community across, various populations. People often think that we're just in India, but we're really in all different parts of the world. And we'll circle back, I think, also to this idea of different professions that we can kind of hone into to do social good. And Induji, I wanted to talk to you specifically about your path of pursuing education, because as I was reading your introduction, I came across the fact that you're the director of education for HUA. So can you talk a little bit about the transition for you choosing the field of education, and what role doing social good for you played in that decision?
Absolutely. Well, I started off as an economist, but unlike you, Parth, I was a very bad economist. That was my first job out of college. I think it was because that's not where my passion or my purpose really was. So I started off as a research assistant in an economics department of an investment bank, and it was intellectually stimulating, and it was certainly a prestigious position and a prestigious route. But when I sat with it, I thought, well, what is it that I'm doing in society or for society? I'm using my intellect. I'm using all of the skills that I've been afforded and that I've worked on, and all of the gifts from Bhagavan. I'm using them to make rich people richer. That's, at the end of the day, that's what I'm doing. And especially living in New York, you see that those extremes. They're so visible, they're so in your face. And this was in the late 90s. This is kind of a particular period in Wall Street. And it was just so obvious to me that I wasn't living a life or choosing a career or leaving the impression according to my internal compass. I wasn't in alignment with my dharma at all. And so I took a deep look at, what it is that I want to do. And like Uma, I knew that I wanted to work with people. I wanted to work within an institution or a system that allowed for me to express, all of my dharmic values, to be compassionate, to be, to express all of these things and include my intellect in all of these things. I am still someone who's interested in the intellect, but I wanted it to sort of include so many more ways of engaging with people in the world. And education, kind of came up, and it was only later that I really understood that actually there are teachers in my family, and there were teachers all around me. We just hadn't paid attention to them because they were all in India, so we hadn't paid as much attention to their careers, because we focused on the careers here in the US that Indian immigrants and Hindu immigrants were typically taking up, and they were, what we now refer to as STEMBA. And I will say, setting medicine aside, especially coming out of the pandemic, we know how much social good our doctors are doing, and everyone in the medical profession. There's no way I'm going to say that is absolutely for social good. That wasn't for me. I can't stand the sight of blood, so I was never going to be a doctor. But apparently I could stand the sight of snot, because I became an elementary school teacher. And it was interesting when I made that transition, it wasn't seen as ambitious, right? So you enter a space where, and it's always interesting to see how schools are positioned as the place that is like, schools are the savior of society, and all of society's issues show up in schools. And yet becoming a teacher is not perceived as an ambitious career. It's perceived as noble, but not ambitious, right? And I think that's very much the case for a lot of professions in social good. They're seen as noble, but not ambitious, right? And I think that's why they often get kind of set, like, do your nobility in the evenings and on the weekends, and then do your ambition 9 to 5. And so for me to live that fully integrated life, for me, there was no doubt this is what I wanted to do. I knew I wanted to do it. I had always loved working with children. I think they're the best people that we have. And so it absolutely made sense. And when I was in my program at Teachers College, it's a program that's committed to social justice. And I remember talking to Uma about this back then, where I was like, somehow the term social justice isn't sitting right for me, but it's also the only framework I see right now that's institutionalized, that takes up this idea that this teaching is not just about teaching. Teaching is a place where we can actually contribute to the greater welfare of society. It's where we can think about how can we address, blind spots, how can we address, and how can we support communities that are disenfranchised or marginalized by systems of power. It was the only place where anything remotely close to that conversation that I wanted to have. It came like kind of close to Dharma, but not really, but it was close enough. But I remember having this conversation where I was like, with Uma, where I was thinking, this isn't it, but it's the closest thing we can do right now. And it's the only place where I feel like I can actually move forward with this in a way that's supported, because I can't just do it on my own right now. And so that just led to a career in education that took me, in various different, into various different roles. So public elementary school teacher. Then we lived in India for a while. And so I was working with educational NGOs in India, Teach for India and Akanksha. And there are millions of educational NGOs in India, and a lot of them are funded by American philanthropic organizations like the Gates Foundation, the Dell Foundation. And that's a whole other conversation for us to have. But I saw very much the impact of even the most nobly intended American educational initiatives and the impact that they were having on very local, very marginalized communities in India. And in particular, how were they, a simple example is Teach for India has a policy of being only teaching in English. And so I saw these kids that, they were the children of migrant workers, and they were fluent in 3 different languages, but they were rendered illiterate because the system was saying English is the only language, right? And so I immediately saw, wow, these same disparities that I'm seeing in the US, when you take it to India, it is astounding, the impact and the influence that American concepts and American philanthropic funds have on the global South, on India. Then came back to the US and got involved with Yes for Schools. And there again, it was that integration of something that had been a personal practice for me for, since my younger son was 6 months old is when I took my first Art of Living course. And it was integrating that. So it was bringing schools and my personal practice of sadhana into schools to address the stress and burnout that we were seeing in schools, not only in students, but in teachers. I have a huge love for teachers, for people who show up to teach, especially in our public schools. And I saw the amount of pressure that was being put on them, and the amount of burnout and turnover that was happening in the teaching force. And we see that now. There's such a huge depletion of the teaching force right now that we're looking at massive teaching shortages because of everything that we're expecting from our teachers, whether it's, getting their students to pass tests in order to even be able to keep their jobs, whether it's to use their bodies as human shields. If there's a gunman that enters the school, I mean, there's so many unrealistic expectations of teachers in the US, in India, everywhere in the world. And the amount of, so you have these people taking on these noble positions that are not considered ambitious, bearing so much, expected to shoulder all of the gaps in how society, or all of the failures of society and our systems in society. And so it was really powerful to see the ways in which these practices could really support them in advocating for changes in these institutions. But then I also saw the gaps in ways that they were being studied and understood. And I can get more into that later. But I began to see also the ways in which this tension between social justice and the ways in which other programs were taking up meditation, for instance, how they were kind of at odds, because social justice in education was noticing that there were other organizations, other interventions, that some loosey-goosey version of meditation was being, taught in schools in order to avoid actually fixing anything about schools. It was used as a band-aid to avoid doing social good. And so then you started to see these accusations. Well, that makes sense, because Eastern philosophies are not concerned with social good. They're only concerned with spiritual bypassing and personal upliftment, right? And so then I was like, okay, I need to qualify myself as a researcher and interrupt this, because this is gaining a lot of steam. that's a
Right.
really complicated answer to some questions that you didn't even ask, but there you go.
No, I think you touched upon a lot of really important threads in what you said, and I definitely do want to come back to this idea of social justice as being a model for doing social good, which I think is problematic and can really alienate a lot of people from actually pursuing this path. But there's another thing that you mentioned also, which I think is really important to pull on right now, which is this idea that, especially within our community, that people who become teachers or people who do a profession that's associated with service, these are noble things, but they're not ambitious, right? You can't really be successful. It's not a traditional notion of success. So how do we disrupt that idea? What does a dharmic metric of success really look like? And how can we kind of evaluate what success really looks like within our community in a more holistic and integrated way that connects back to our dharma? If Umaji or Dipali, you want to take off from where Induji left off on that.
Yeah, I think I want to quickly jump in here, because while I was working at HAF, I got to interact with a lot of people from the State Department, which is a branch of the government, as well as other government organizations and entities like the US Commission on International Religious Freedom. Here, there were a lot of decisions being made and a lot of things being written about Hindus or that affected Hindus, but not a lot of practicing devout Hindus were in these organizations. There were certainly people from other faiths represented, which is fantastic, but we didn't see a lot of devout practicing Hindus in these spaces. And the reason why I am emphasizing devout and practicing is sometimes there may be Indians or Hindus in that space, but they're the kind that don't like Hinduism and want to distance themselves from Hinduism as much as possible. So the first thing I would say is, how can we, think about success is broadening. For me, it's definitely broadening as a Hindu community, our idea of what different professions are available. Certainly, if you're, working at the State Department, you can work yourself up to very high levels. They're high-paying jobs, they're highly influential, they're very respectable, but not a lot of people, at least that aunties and uncles that I'm familiar with, would know about the State Department or the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. So, for me, it's very important that as I'm talking to, the older generations, and now as an expectant mother, I'm opening up those possibilities for the generations to come and the current Hindu youth in the United States to say, well, think about it. Medicine, engineering, those are great professions. Law, fantastic. Outside of those, there are organizations you can be a part of where you can be paid. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom is actually voluntary, but in the State Department, you can work at very high levels. You could be highly influential, and those are working in the government. You can also work for certain nonprofit organizations like Amnesty International that are saying things that affect Hindus in very real ways in places outside of the U.S. especially. But there are not a lot of Hindus that are interacting with this. Similarly, the United Nations needs a lot more devout practicing Hindus, people that feel their Hindu identity, no matter what their Hindu background is, but that they feel it deeply. They've gone deeply into it, and they value whatever they have learned from our sacred texts, whatever they have learned from our gurus. They value it. Those are the people we need in these spaces. So I would say the first step is to expand our understanding of what are the possible professions. I know growing up, we only saw a few professions. Like we saw, for example, teacher, or we saw, doctor when we went to the doctor's office. So if somebody asked us, what did we want to be? We would choose from whatever we have interacted with before. And the Hindu community, unfortunately, isn't interacting at the highest levels with the UN, with the State Department. So we need those doors to be opened up. And all the panelists, the attendees on this call are in a great position to support the next generations in taking these professions, studying political science, studying these things that are a little bit off the beaten path, that will create opportunities to actually be successful in new ways that maybe as a Hindu community we're not as familiar with.
That's a really, really important point you make, that there's a lot of professions that have a potential to do really great for our community and also for the communities we live in general, that Hindus often don't pursue. I really quickly want to follow up on that idea, though, by suggesting that maybe the reason why people don't pursue these careers is because they feel as though if they did, they would face a lot of opposition within them. They feel as though they're not spaces that are welcoming. So is that something that you've seen pushback on? And how do you think people can kind of overcome that hump and embrace these these professions as ways to actually do social good?
Sorry, I'll try and make this brief, Umaji, because I want to hear what you have to say about this important topic. I think the biggest thing that young people can do is to have a plan. So you don't just say, I'm going into political science, and your elders, if any of you young people are listening, they're going to ask you an important question. Well, what are you going to do with that? I studied religious studies and my elders had a lot of questions. The aunties and uncles, my parents were like, what are you going to do with studying religious studies, which is a very valid question. It's not an illegitimate question. So to have a plan and to look up what internships do I need to get which jobs, and to explain to our elders, okay, these are the jobs. This is what I need to do to get to those jobs. These are the degrees I need, the certification I need. And this is how much they pay. This is where they're located, to really get into the details and share that information. I think that's the best way to deal with pushback, is to be prepared and to be, have open communication. And then once we share that, this is a high paying salary and I'm very interested in this, and this is why I think I would be good at this profession, then, our elders will always understand. And, as, parents and grandparents, when we provide that opportunity for younger people to explain, why are you interested in this? What is the salary? What are the challenges you may face? Going into all of that in detail will only make us stronger as families and as communities.
Yeah, I know, I appreciate it. And it was helpful to kind of hear your framing of all of this as well, Deepali. Like I'm thinking as well of the journey that our parents have actually had to go through as well with this, because it is really challenging to be like, what are your kids doing? And one, maybe now they can sort of kind of explain it, but it'll take about half an hour to explain what each of us does, which is very different from, my kid's a lawyer and they're working at this X prestigious firm. And so I would say, for any of the parents who are on this webinar right now as well, to take that time to be curious, to explore, to ask those questions, to seek to understand before jumping to conclusions, that it is whatever kind of general notion that you might have or not have about what it is that these professions are about. I think the other piece to keep in mind is that I'll speak to the United States, the kind of philanthropic nonprofit industrial complex as an industry is rooted in Christianity. It's rooted in a very particular understanding of what the relationship is between, and it's very gendered, like philanthropy, for example, was the wives of rich people. This is what they spent their time doing, is, taking some of that wealth and doing charitable works as good Christians. This is not our frame to the relationship between social change or seva and the purpose of life. But we've absorbed all of that narrative, all of those notions that this is a side project. Like one of the things I joke about, but I get pretty frustrated in is, oh, you do nonprofit, as if that means something. Like nonprofit is a tax status. It's a type of organization, but this idea that your life is about purpose and contribution in some way, like let's reclaim that. Let's actually say, hey, let's do this the way that makes sense to us. And I think the same, when Indu and I have both been on a journey together around our relationship with social justice. Social justice is also rooted in Christianity, and there's a reason why it feels uncomfortable to put it on at first, and it's sort of like it's a maybe good enough, but it starts to bring you, at least for myself, it started to bring me down a path which felt deeply at odds with my own, in like the what my guru has taught me about how to look at people, what it actually means to hold a space of human evolution and compassion, and that, you know, change is possible, and that people don't fall into categories of good and evil. Kind of, it's not so black and white. Like, our entire Hindu frame allows us to navigate paradox. It allows us to navigate that there are things that maybe in this moment in time it made sense, and then the context changed and it doesn't make sense anymore. So it is both about, like, sort of, let's just stand up and stand forward and say, hey, we actually have a lens and a frame to social change that's actually going to equip us as a people, as a society. So as Hindus, but also as Hindus, we can lead the charge on how could and should we be looking at social change. So like the work that my organization is doing right now, it's on advancing this idea of pluralism. And what's interesting is, so I was brought in as the first executive director, but it was sort of already named and described as new pluralists. And this idea that pluralism is kind of a recent American phenomenon, right? It's this idea that, so pluralism, if you were to sort of distill it, is this idea of being able to have harmony in diversity, being able to see that there is the light that exists within each individual, and that no matter what conflict or tension that might exist, that we are inherently also interconnected, and that we have a responsibility to be able to maintain and forge those lines of deep, that sense of belonging. You know, and this is Vasudhaiva Kutumbakam. This is that sense of I am part of. This is non-duality in its deepest sense. And so this idea that even now, as I'm leading this kind of new charge, this new organization that is starting to get, you know, pretty significant visibility. You know, it was elevated by Biden in the White House as something that is an important thing that philanthropy starts to put significant resources into. That it's not a matter of like retrofitting myself as a Hindu. It's saying, hey, the Hindu lens is a pluralistic lens. Let's do it. Let's bring it forward. Let's bring this deep lineage into the future in a really incredible way. And that I think is the invitation too, is that it's about preserving and protecting the what definitely is being under assault, under attack. And it's also elevating ourselves as the gifts that we are to this moment too.
Yeah, if I can just add to that. And Parth, I understood your question around pushback to be more about pushback within the institutions and not necessarily within our families, although that part is also really important. So thank you for addressing that, Deepali. For me, I would say, you know, as someone in academia, there are definitely certain disciplines that we know are designed to be Hindu phobic, Indology, South Asian studies, you know, all of that. But then, and I've said this multiple times, and there are, I know people attending this that have heard me say this. There are the adjacent fields like education, the work that Uma does, etc., where there just haven't been Hindus with Shraddha speaking as Hindus and saying, I'm here not despite the fact that I'm Hindu, I'm here because I'm Hindu, right? That is what informed my journey to arrive at this place. And that is what orients me in this space. And as a Hindu, not only does my philosophy or the way that my worldview and my understanding of all of these systems, does that contribute to the conversation and our shared goals of just making the world better, you know, to sort of reduce it. But also the ways in which all of you have been attempting to do this has disenfranchised my community is a really good case study on the limitations of social justice. So let's unpack that. And when I've done that in educational conferences, what I've heard from other educational scholars is, thank you for articulating the thing that was bothering me about the way we've been going about this in education. I just didn't have the words or the case study or the specific way to understand it. But I could see that we were headed down a path that isn't a good path. And this isn't to dismiss everything that everyone is doing in that space, but there are ways in which both the outlook of Hindus, but also the experience of the Hindu community and the Hindu American community can really contribute to the greater good. And this, I when I look at, and I know teachers get a lot of get a lot of criticism, especially teachers who say, I'm here for social justice, and within our community that has a certain implication. It's social justice has been weaponized against Hindus and Hindu Americans in a certain way. But I really see it as, they're showing up when social justice is code for social good. It's been conflated with social good. What they're really showing up for is because they want to decrease suffering in the world. They want to help their students and their students' families. That's what I see when I interact with teachers and emergent teachers. That's what I've seen in the space of teacher education. Their intentions are good. They are actually really good. They're not looking to silence people. They're not, and it's just a matter of, well, what's being offered to them? What possibilities do they see in front of them? And when we widen the range of possibilities, like Uma was saying, I think it is to everyone's benefit. It actually does help everyone. So I would say, let's not take the animosity and the obstacles and the everything that we know exists in spaces like South Asian studies and Indology, and let's not imagine that that's fully migrated to all of the other disciplines and institutional spaces already, because we're just cutting ourselves off from doing exactly what Diwali was describing, which is let us bring and enliven Shraddha in these spaces, because it's to everyone's benefit.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the really important threads that you also touched upon was the idea of being open and accepting to the fact that a lot of these areas and disciplines are open to Hindus participating in them, and perhaps they just haven't had that experience of having Hindus with Shraddha be in those spaces. So I think that's really important for us to also remember and to take with us. Umaji, you mentioned one really important thing when you were speaking, which is the idea that Hinduism's concept of dharma, which is more nuanced, is contextual, can help reduce differences and frictions in today's society, as opposed to a model that believes in black and white, especially given how much affective polarization there's been in the US. Treating others as black or as white is not really helpful in reducing that polarization. So what are some other models that exist within Hindu Dharma that can help us solve some of the most pressing challenges that exist within the world globally? Because I think this is an important point that we often don't think about, is that social justice exists as Induji articulated, as you all articulated, as a model and as the model really of doing social good. So how can we offer alternatives to that that are beneficial not only to the general community, but also within our own community? We see so many younger people gravitating towards social good, which in the end has a tendency to also cannibalize Hindu Dharma in many ways. So what is the alternative that we can offer that will benefit not just, again, the community at large, but also our own community and the generations that are yet to come?
I mean, I think it's a really great question, and I would say it's an ongoing question for us too. It's an inquiry. I think a lot of it is actually putting that question out there, is like, if we want to find ourselves stepping out of this polarity that we find ourselves stuck in, that we find ourselves entrenching ourselves in, it actually takes a great deal of that inner work, that inner lens in. I mean, that is the Hindu practice as well, is what am I doing? What can I let go of? What emotions are going on within me? So that ability to actually take that inward stroke that is part of our path, is part of our tradition, is, I think, one of the most important first steps. And I think this is the part that makes it distinct from, I think, in a lot of cases, the way that a Western paradigm might approach is, oh, there's a problem, there's a symptom, let me fix it. Whereas we try to get underneath and understand the whole in a different way. We start off by asking, how am I contributing to the problem? We're not just deciding I am inherently, because my intention is good, I am inherently doing good with every action that I take. And that ability to have that self-referral and have that muscle built of, first, let me actually look inward. understand my inner environment, that then gives me the ability to more truly perceive what's going on around me, to be able to potentially see different possibilities, different pathways there. And I think this is where it is both a frame, it's a lens that we bring to things, but it also requires practice. This is the importance of actually the yogic practices that we have, the rituals that we have that actually allow us to step out of, sometimes it actually takes stepping out of the conflict, going and actually immersing ourselves in some other environment, whether it's our internal environment doing something physiological to kind of move us down a different path. It could sometimes have to do with making an offering, having that space to be able to have surrender suddenly can open us up and out of a particular conflict as well. This other piece of, we started off by, I think a number of us said namaste, like this very concept that there is divinity inside of you, even though, and because even I so greatly disagree with everything that you stand for, everything that you do, and yet I cannot deny the fact that you are also me, that we actually are the same being, and I can honor that. And that alone, that sense of honor for the other being can allow us to kind of dissolve and put the arms down a little bit as well. And so I think when I think about young people, so a lot of my time when I was teaching with Art of Living was actually working with a lot of young people. And I would say it was young people who were Hindu, who grew up Hindu, who were coming back home to some degree to the kind of the principles and the practices that, for whatever reason, because of the conditions that we are finding ourselves in the ways that Hinduism was understood, it was sort of a need to kind of re-strengthen some of those ties and to feel a sense of like, wow, there is some really good stuff that exists like within our own tradition. Let's honor it, and let's have it be, as Indu, you were saying, be joyful, be a celebration. That is actually a really important part of what strengthens those ties for us, is that it should actually be fun and like maybe even a little cool to be Hindu, to be holding on to some of this. And then to be able to have that modeling, those connection points. And I think that is actually the power. And it's so interesting to me that we're all coming from these guru traditions as well, is to be able to have others who are seeking, who are on these paths, to be able to be those mentors and role models for young people to kind of navigate and make some of these choices as well.
Excellent. So there's a question from an audience member. So they're asking about Hindu phobia. So can you explain a little bit about how you understand Hindu phobia and see it operating in US society? And I think this is relevant to what you've all said. Deepalaji, you talked about how atrocities against Hindus are not often recognized. Umaji, you talked about how a lot of Hindu traditions are often demonized. And Induji, you're part of the understanding, you're the co-convener of the Understanding Hindu Phobia Initiative. So how do we see that operating in the US? And how do you think social justice frameworks actually cannibalize Hinduism, which is a term that I used? So if anybody wants to take on that question and talk about how it relates, I guess, back to the topic of doing social good.
Yeah, I mean, I think if we start off with the ways that Hindu phobia is denied, one of them touches upon the work that Deepalaji has done, the really difficult work that Deepalaji has done around Hindu genocide and the denial of the persecution of Hindus. So one of the claims made is that Hindu phobia doesn't exist because Hindus have never been persecuted because of our religion, right? And the other is that Hindu phobia is a contemporary invention to camouflage the Islamophobia of contemporary Hindus who support the current Indian administration. Both of those claims are made. And to that, I would say the way in which I understand Hindu phobia, or the ways in which it manifests in the US, is that it's a denial of Hindu history. It's the erasure of Hindu history in the Hindu consciousness, never mind the global consciousness, the persecution of Hindus in Hindu consciousness. And two, it is the continuation of colonial constructions of Hinduism. The purpose of these constructions was obviously to compel conversion and to justify colonization. That we are, the original, the OG social justice was colonization. We're doing this for their good because they obviously can't take care of themselves. So colonization is a humanitarian effort to intervene in this native society that is running amok, and we need to save them from themselves. That's the OG, right? And so when we look at the contemporary version of that, perhaps it's not administrative or military control in exactly the same way, although we can dig into that a little bit more. It's definitely happening at the level of consciousness, of how people are thinking about their own traditions, etc. And so it is very closely linked to morality, right? Which takes us back to social good. So Hindu phobia is framed as a moral good. If you are a good person, you're going to call for the external reformation of this tradition and of these people that clearly are inherently immoral. And that's what makes it really dangerous when kids go to college. Our kids go to college or go to school and are taught that Hindu phobia is inherently and irredeemably immoral and amoral. So immoral, like everything about the tradition is committed to oppression, and amoral, not concerned with social good, right? So even some of the people that we consider to be Hindu philic, Emerson and Thoreau, argued in the United States 100 years before we really lived here, that Hinduism was, and Eastern philosophies in general, were phenomenal for personal spiritual growth, but were not so concerned with turning outward and looking at the world and doing social good, because they had that nice Christian binary. Whereas Protestantism is like so good at doing social good, but not as good at the sort of personal self-reflection. And so like, let's take the best of both worlds, East meets West. And that binary has been internalized. And even amongst our own community, you find Hindus a lot of the time spiritually bypassing the actual work of social good in the world, even recognizing the genocide of our own people by this sort of turn the other cheek approach, which is like, let me just, Godsplain myself out of having to actually do any good in the world, even if it pertains to the survival of my own community.
I want to expand a little bit on what Induji was mentioning about the erasure of Hindu history. And by erasure, I mean just the erasing, the deleting from many, many different contexts, but especially in academic spaces, situations in which Hindus were victims, as well as the true, authentic Hindu knowledge. And by that, I mean not the Kama Sutra, not just looking at Krishna Bhagwan and Radhaji as common lovers, but as, Devi Devta. And so, that's what I mean by erasure, is just completely changing what it means to be a Hindu in terms of Hindu knowledge as well as Hindu history. And so to answer Devadattaji's question about where is the Hindu phobia operating in the United States, the place that I see it operating at that most commonly, most frequently, most pervasively is at colleges and universities, specifically in, like Induji mentioned, South Asia studies and religious studies programs, but also just generally when, there are activists from Indian or Hindu backgrounds. Of course, there are a lot of Hindus outside of India, imagining that Hinduism is inherently oppressive and then trying to create policies in their own university about caste or about, trying to dismantle Holi with a sacred, festival. All of these things are happening right now, and they're very deeply problematic. And so I would say the biggest thing, that we have to keep in mind when we're trying to do social good as Hindus is that there's a lot of efforts to externally reform, change Hinduism from the outside. But Hinduism was the first to criticize itself. Hinduism was the first to reform itself. We have so many reformers. We have so many amazing, sadhus and bhakts who went above and beyond to reject everything that society was telling them and do the opposite and uplift, millions of people. So let's not buy into this imagined history where Hinduism, is moral failings and then it needs to be helped by colonizers and other religious groups. Hinduism, if there is any reformation to be done, Hindus did it first. And we've been doing it for millennia. So we have to look to our history and take strength in the reformers, in all the people that said no to any kind of discrimination and actually did things against the grain of society sometimes when it wasn't acceptable to, for example, be Mirabai and constantly worship Bhagwan and not be affected by gender stereotypes or speak out against caste discrimination, which in many times in Hindu history was a reality. But there have been countless reformers. Bhagwan Swaminarayan, who is my Ishtadev, worked so hard on reforming caste discrimination. And when people tried to tell me, I learned about caste in school. I never learned about it as a Hindu. Going to India, I never learned it. I had to ask my parents, what caste am I, to even find out about caste discrimination and what this means. And so there's so many efforts to try and change what Hindus know to be true and to erase our realities. And so we have to be very careful, especially in the colleges and universities. We have to be able to speak up for ourselves calmly, with confidence, but persistently. If we speak up once, then it's almost as if we didn't speak at all. We have to keep showing up to every meeting, to every opportunity, and saying what we know to be true calmly and confidently. And eventually that will make a difference. But this Hindu phobia is going to remain if we don't speak up, if we don't put in the effort.
I think that's really well said.
It's really
Yeah,
well
go ahead.
said. And what it made me think of, is we know that there are certain institutions that are particularly sort of well springs of Hindu phobia. And there is one such institution, a public institution in Part's home state of New Jersey, that is vibrantly Hindu phobic. And oftentimes you'll hear Hindus say, well, let's boycott, right? Which is like a very 1920s India approach to social change. But does it lead to institutional change, right? Even if all of the Hindus from New Jersey boycotted that institution, it's still receiving Hindu tax dollars. Like, it's not devoid of Hindu money, right? I think there's a difference between that and going in and saying, actually, this university has the largest concentration of Hindus in the country. And so let's use that to our advantage and do something, and not just speak once, but actually reclaim our space here. This is our space. This is a public institution. It belongs to us. It's answerable to us. And I think that's that synergy, that integration of being American and Hindu, because that's a very American thing to say, right? We look at our public leaders as civil servants. They work for us. They're answerable to the public. Democracy is answerable to the public. The media is answerable. Everyone, all of these public institutions are answerable to the public. So I think there's great potential for that in American-raised Hindus, because we start learning that in second grade, third grade. We start studying the Constitution. We understand our rights in a really different way, oftentimes, than our immigrant parents do. So I think there's some great possibility there. And what does it take to create that change? It's not a one and done conversation. The civil rights movement in America was not just MLK getting up there and making one really good speech, and all of a sudden schools were integrated and everything became better. It's certainly not, and let me preface all of this by saying we've been talking about colonization, and I think it's really important to move with awareness around the impact of $45 trillion being stolen from the country, and the impact of poverty and the depletion of resources on the mindsets of people. It makes sense that our community has this hyper focus on the acquisition of wealth, because a few people, a very small minority, notwithstanding, we don't have intergenerational wealth. We might be compared to the most elite white communities in the US, but those communities have intergenerational wealth. We don't. For the most part, we don't. We're working for our reparations. around the world. So I say that with a lot of compassion and awareness that that contributes to why that's how we think about success, is because we are working to gain back what was stolen from us. But I think also, oh, now I've forgotten where I'm going with this. Oh, yes. One of the other impact of colonization. No, now I've completely lost my train of thought because I got so worked up about the $45 trillion that all I can think about is the Kohinoor diamond right now.
No, it's totally fine. I think one of the really important points that both you and Dipaliji made was the importance of always being persistent in calling out Hinduphobia, in correcting the narrative. And I see Dipaliji being very persistent today as well in the chat. And how ironic also that, Bapshri Swaminarayan is being blamed for caste discrimination in the modern context, when indeed they were kind of the OG people fighting against Jati Pratha. I want to take the conversation away from Hinduphobia because we talked about it so much.
Do you mind if I just make one
sure. Go ahead,
minor, because I just I think
absolutely.
it's an interesting full circle thing, is that we actually need those of us who are Hindu to be deeply steeped in everything that we're talking about, like how you actually make change happen, like into what you just described as well, of it's not just a one and done. When we think about how do you make shifts in narrative happen, what is the role of research and education and academic institutions in the understanding of how movements work, how change happens. Like this isn't something that we just have to guess at. And in fact, by having more Hindus who are across multiple different dimensions of the social change field and discipline, that's actually how we're going to be able to grapple with Hinduphobia. And it doesn't have to be a side project, an evening project, a weekend project. Yes, there is room for everybody. Not everybody needs to enter a career in this, but we actually need to have our people deeply immersed and skillful at this as well. And that takes time.
Oh yeah. Now that you've said that, now I remember what I was going to say. So I'll just say it quickly and then Parth will get back to you. But you often hear this commentary from the Hindu American or the diasporic Hindu community. We're successful, so why are we experiencing Hinduphobia? We do so well and we earn so much money, and we make we're at the tops of corporations, and it's this big disconnect, because if you grow up American, you recognize that, that's not the argument being made by other communities looking for their persecution to be recognized, or other communities looking for, right? That's very much a colonial mindset that assumes that you have a benevolent master who, if you behave, you'll be rewarded. And therefore, if you're not getting rewarded, if you're getting spoken down to, why is that the case? There's a lot of work. There's a lot of that self-study to do. Why do I believe what I believe about American society? I'm seeing this thread of comments in the chat. Why do I believe what I do about Hindu scriptures? Who led me to believe that? Who benefits from me believing that our scriptures are inherently discriminatory? Who benefited from Hindus believing that about ourselves? Certainly wasn't Hindus, because as Dipali pointed out, Hindus have been working on reform, and there are mechanisms for reform within our tradition that predate colonization. So we were kind of aware that, and that's where the entire tradition of gurus come from. And all of our scriptures really understand that there are these tendencies of the small mind, and our knowledge is there to remind us and wake us up from these tendencies of the small mind and pull us into the bigger mind, right? That's why we don't just do this on our own. That's why this is not just philosophical, it's societal. It says that society and human beings have this tendency towards these things. We have these ritis. We have, that's why it's not just about dharma, it's about leading a yogic life that is about self-reflection. So if this is a part of our scriptures, how can we say that they are simultaneously inherently discriminatory, right? There are all of these conflations that have been created both through translation and also just through the motivations of the people translating and colonization. So if we're not asking, why do I believe what I do about Hinduism, and where did I learn those ideas? then we're simply kind of like being taken for this sort of colonial ride that's not going to end with a greater understanding of Hinduism. And I don't believe ends in greater social good either, because I don't believe that we reach greater social good by misunderstanding people.
Yeah, absolutely. So I want to touch on a thread that both I think you and Umaji also we're referencing, which is this idea of having role models, knowing how you can go into these institutions to make change. And I think having examples to look towards is something that's always really important, because I think knowing what's possible is always the first step to really going into it. I think the biology you spoke earlier about, like, young people, it's important to have a plan, right? So like if you see someone who's already done it, it's much easier for you to make a plan. Otherwise, you're kind of like trying to figure it out on your own, and that can be very isolating. So for each of you, how did you kind of navigate the spaces that you're in? Like, who were your role models? And maybe the answer is your gurus, right? That's one of the things that Induji you were just talking about. But maybe there's others. So I just want to open it up to all of you. What were some of the examples and role models that you looked up to when you went into these spaces? Again, not necessarily places where there are a lot of devout Hindus, but how did you kind of navigate that and look for examples?
I can start. I think definitely my guru was my biggest inspiration of how to go about things, but specifically in studying religious studies or working in the nonprofit space, I wouldn't say I had a specific role model. And I think now that, I've been more steeped in these spaces, there are people that I would look to and say, wow, they're really good, but they're, really accomplished, and I want to learn more from them. But, even studying religious studies, I remember I was speaking to a devout Hindu professor, of course, they will remain nameless, who said to me, if you want to, be a professor, don't say anything. Don't say anything that could be controversial until you're tenured. And then I started hearing at the highest levels, well, they said, don't say anything until you get to be a professor. And then in being a professor, there's this period called trying to become tenured. So then then professors were saying, well, don't say anything controversial until you've finished tenure. So PhD can take such a long time. Then getting tenured can take such a long time. And so getting it, this advice from somebody that I respected, from a practicing Hindu professor, was very shocking to me. So I actually had a lot of, instead of having, role models in the practical everyday space, I had a lot of naysayers telling me, don't say anything, or my parents saying, don't study this. But I want to touch on briefly, because I think this is connected to what you were saying, this question in the Q&A about how can you switch to social good as a career? And I would say, just like you were mentioning, part of, that point about have a plan. If you want to switch to a full-time career, that's definitely possible. There's also many things that you can get involved in, such as interfaith groups, where you can come and share information about Hinduism, advocate for Hindus. The U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, which I mentioned a few times, is voluntary. So they're volunteers that are recommended to be a part of this very important entity. So you could have your own career and then also be involved in these types of things. But how does that happen? Well, you have to put in the effort and build up your resume. And so if you're looking at changing your career or modifying your career to be more targeted towards social good, especially social good for Hindus, I think, and any kind of social good, you have to find those people that are already in those places, that have that position, that they are, working for the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom, or they do have certain positions, whether it's, being on the city council or, being a local politician, anything like that. Look at the resumes of people that are there now and start working on building up your resume. This can take years. But this is very practical, to look at the resumes of the people that are already in the positions that you want. First, identifying those positions is important, but then look at the look at their resumes. All their information, of course, will be publicly available. You just have to search properly and then start building your resume. And that could take at least a few years. But over time, you'll be in a good position to help not only Hindus, but our greater American community. And so this is definitely possible if you want to switch your career or modify your career or do more for social good, even outside of your career. All of that is definitely possible. Even if we're working in businesses or, we're working in stores, whatever our situation is in life, we can always do social good. So we just have to look for those opportunities, whether it's being your union rep or being a local politician or something even beyond that. We have to open ourselves up to those possibilities and then put in the work and then of building our resumes to be that and making those relationships, meeting the people that will be able to put us in those positions. So building our resumes, meeting the right people, that's what we can do to change our career or our extracurricular activities to be targeted more towards social good.
I would agree with Deepali that I don't think I had any particular role models. I was just really taking a risk. There was no one that I was looking at that I was modeling my life after. I was just going with bhakti and surrender, total surrender. When I got to my doctoral program, my advisor, who's not Hindu, she considers herself to be a Buddhist, but it's very much that white Buddhism. But she told me, she said, grad school is when you can really take risks and say whatever you want and not worry. It's only when you get your first position that you have to start being political. And so I just took that because I didn't need too much incentive. I just took that and ran with it. And then I kind of couldn't get out of the habit of just speaking my mind. But in terms of role models, I would say I have often, and I've talked to Uma about this, I have often longed for that mentor who's at the next step that can help me. And I don't know of anyone. If you are out there and you're listening, please reach out to me. And the other thing I'll say is, and I am excited to talk about this. This is a huge part of the work we're doing at HUA. I am co-designing, or we are co-designing this really incredible professional doctoral program in Hindu studies that does exactly what we're talking about. It marries the Hindu perspective with all of these different disciplines and really is sort of this incubator for field building, which is something that, Uma and I talk a lot about. Field building is, and maybe Uma, you can talk about this a bit more, because I think that's really the direction this conversation is kind of headed. But it's about, not only what does our next generation of Hindu American leaders of our institutions look like, but what does it mean to have Hindu presence and Hindu perspectives in all of our major institutions that impact public welfare, that impact social consciousness, that impact how everyone is thinking about how do we strive towards a more perfect union together, and how do Hindus show up for that, and what do we have to say to contribute to that, right? And so we are beginning to do it at an institutional level. I think that's really important for us to celebrate and support. That maybe 10 years from now, young Hindus will say, well, these are my role models, as opposed to there are not a lot that I can find. I think that's a really great sankalpa for us as a community, is to create a generation of role models so that in the future our children have lots of role models to look to.
So I'll name, my ultimate role model is my Gurudev Sri Sri Ravi Shankar, both in terms of the deep internal development that I've been able to get as a leader, as how I make sense of the world around me, how our wisdom tradition, everything can help me make meaning. And so there's a continual, every time I'm immersed in Sangha, satsang with him, it is both my own development, but I'm always also pinging on, well, then what does this have to do with collective consciousness? What does this have to do with social change? Like, I feel like I'm perennially in that moment with him, in my relationship, in my dialogue with him. And I've also had the opportunity of seeing him in action, in negotiating peace, in sitting and talking with activists, because Gurudev is a very actively, like socially actively engaged guru. That is also his flavor, is very much about relevance in the world and showing up as a leader, as a Hindu leader in the world too. And I've been so blessed to actually be able to be in some really beautiful dialogue spaces with him, where I've seen how he engages and kind of models how to enable people to open their minds, to negotiate conflict across seemingly impossible impasses. And what is that skill that takes? And where is it that he's quiet? Because there is not a readiness, there is not a ripeness that's there. So for me, so much of how I show up as a social change leader is so guided by the modeling that Gurudev has given me in that process. And also, I have found, because I've been, more deeply embedded within Art of Living as well, a number of teachers and as well as sevaks within Art of Living who. And I would say, like, it's to not to put all of the pressure on perfection on any one of them, but there's a beautiful expression of a flavor of some sort of skill or some sort of way of moving about making change happen that I've been able to absorb and learn from over the years as well. And I think this is the opportunity of sort of seva projects that might exist within any one of our spiritual organizations. Is it's a way to kind of build the muscles. Like, how do you inspire people? How do you ignite people to be volunteers with you? How do you make sense of, okay, what's the challenge that we want to take on? What do we care about? What are we complaining about that therefore indicates we should probably take some responsibility for it? And so there can be a way in which, in that journey from kind of if in making a shift in a career, that we can actually use seva sort of volunteering opportunities as well to start to give us an indication of, oh, wow, I really care about this thing. Like, I know, Indu, for you with getting into education, some of it started with you mentoring kids while you were an economist and starting to see, like, wow, there's something that's lighting up in me right now as a result. I'm going to speak on your behalf because, I'm allowed to, because you're my sister. And so with that, I think, there's always room. There's always an opportunity to sort of take that other path. And, I think the other piece is, not striving, I think in seeking out mentors, to not put the perfection on any one person, that they're going to completely embody everything that you want to become, but instead everyone can kind of offer gifts and perspectives that might help sharpen and shape your own mode. And, in a very practical sense, in Dipale. So I like the very practical way that you've laid it out in terms of resume and in terms of relationships. Just keep meeting people, like, get outside the bubble of the people that you know already, the day-to-day routine, and, just meet tons and tons of people out in the world. And some people will be irritating and their analysis will be wrong. But that's great. Learn that and then go meet other people and, allow that relationship. I learn a lot by relationships and by seeing how other people do things. It helps me sharpen how I might want to do things and ask people their stories. People love to tell the stories of their own journeys. I mean, look at us. We're like hanging out on a Sunday for an hour and a half because people like telling the story, their own stories. So ask those stories of people that you admire. People love to mentor other people too, kind of at any stage. I've found that both in terms of people I've kind of asked to mentor me, but also when people ask if I can mentor them, it's kind of hard to say, no, I don't want to show up for you. Like, it's a very beautiful kind of relationship that we can have. And so just be unabashed in asking people for that as well. It doesn't have to be a permanent relationship, but it can be for some period of time. Can I watch what you're doing? Can I ask you questions afterwards? And that can actually be a really great way to start to feel out what might be the right path for you. And especially if you're young. If you're 19 years old, like, it's 100% expected. You probably shouldn't know exactly what you want to do. Like, use that right time to just try a bunch of stuff before you really kind of find that focus as well.
Yeah, and I really want to actually take off from that idea, because we have 5 minutes left, and I think it's a really good way to end the conversation, to also face our audience, which is that, this idea of doing social good is something that within Hindu Dharma is available to everyone. It's not something that's restricted based on your profession or something that's restricted to a certain community or a certain group of people. So how can everyone kind of find their way of doing social good within their own calling, within their own Swadharma, within what they're already doing, make it an integrated part of their life, rather than thinking of it as a side project? That was an idea that I think Umaji, you had mentioned at the start of this conversation. So Deepali-ji, closing thoughts for you on that question before we wrap up.
I think making sure that we show up as Hindu and are wholly ourselves wherever we are is the best way to move towards social good, so that we're continuously, engaging in bhakti, engaging in seva, engaging in antardrashti, self-reflection. And in addition to that, I think one of the most important things we can do is whatever speaks to us in the Hindu traditions, whatever mandir or sanstha or panth or mat, go deep and really understand, really support financially, through volunteering, every way we can, all of our Hindu institutions, and make sure that we go deep, we understand fully, what exactly do I believe and how am I going to make it real in my life? So I think that's the biggest way we can move towards social good.
I want to, I guess, pick up from where Uma left off in terms of the inspiration that our guru provides. And I think what I find to be so powerful, what opened up so much possibility for me, is in seeing him, have a conversation like with the FARC and the Colombian government, wearing his dhoti, like showing up visibly as a Hindu, having these conversations. It's incredible, like how powerful it is to see. It's not just the words, it's not just the conversation, it's the practice, it's his presence, all of it. And I think that idea of presence is really important, right? And I think we've all touched upon this, that doing good for the world is as much an internal process as it is an external one. You can't transform the world without transforming yourself, and you can't transform yourself without transforming the world. And so it's not about going out there and preaching verses from the Bhagavad Gita to people with this sort of moral high ground or moral certitude. If you haven't examined yourself and you're not examining how you're engaging in these spaces with a great deal of self-awareness and humility, then you're going to be received as someone who doesn't have a lot of self-awareness or humility in these spaces. It's going to limit your effectiveness. So if you want to be effective and good at this, you really, you can't do it without that self-study, right? Studying the world is studying ourselves, is that swadhyaya. And so I think really having that commitment to engaging those parts of ourselves that may not be so fun for other people is really, really important in doing this work. So I think when we do that, when we don't just focus, when we have that integrity, right? You brought up the word integration. When you have that integrity in how you're approaching social good, I mean, when it's integrated, that self-study is integrated with the way you're engaging with other people. And I think also, this is the part that touches upon the being American, which is that Americans, there's this tendency in our community to be kind of really humble and not really talk about what we're doing. And there's this tendency in American society to market everything that you do. And so those things can kind of be at odds, right? Like we do, any punyam from seva is taken away if we talk about it. So we don't talk about it. But then people don't know when the Hindu community is doing good because we're not talking about it. We're not advertising it because it's not in our nature to advertise it. So I think there's some interesting discussion or something for us to discover in that space, because people don't really know us. We don't really know ourselves around this area of social good. We're not going to go around advertising it and creating like publicity shots of Hindus doing social good, but then nobody knows when we do. And so that's sort of this question, I guess I'm leaving out there for everyone, but really it comes back to that integrity and that turning inward as we turn outward.
There's just like one phrase I want to kind of close out with it that our guru says, which is walk like a king and be a perfect servant. And so just being able to have that full sense of we are kings, like we are carrying this incredible, rich depth, this timeless wisdom, this timeless practice, and we're here to serve in every instant.
Thank you so much for all of our panelists for sharing such deep thoughts and such wisdom with our audience here today. And I'm sure they've given us all a lot of food for thought about how we can do social good within our own lives.